Welcome back, everyone. This is Austin Revel right here at 2F by C Tactical in New Prague, Minnesota. Kind of excited to bring you some updates. And this is kind of going to be a big one in terms of busting some gun myths. And I'm kind of contemplating doing I don't even know what you want to call it, myth busting Thursdays maybe, or something like that, where we kind of take some common myths or misconceptions about firearms or even statistics or something like that, and we kind of break them down, where they come from, and then also why they're wrong. Is that something you would like? Please comment down below. And if there's some myths you would like us to tackle and bust, also shoot us a comment and we'll try to do that. Now, when it comes to today's video, again, please like, comment, subscribe. We're on our drive for 25. We're trying to get to 25,000 followers before SHOT Show. If you could help us do that, share our videos and help us grow, help the channel grow. We always plan on keeping this channel free. There will be some stuff that we might have coming up that YouTube won't allow us to show, I should say. And if we do have that, that will be over on our Patreon account. If you'd like to support us, please come to Patreon. But again, we do that just for support, not necessarily. It helps us, keep the lights on around here. Not because we want to put anything behind a paywall necessarily. That's not the goal here. Now, with that being said, today I want to dive into just some gun violence statistics, and that's kind of that's going to be the myth that we tried to bust today. And this is good news too, just broadly speaking, because it doesn't matter if you lose your life from a firearm or from a knife or just from an accident. Anytime someone loses their life, it's always a tragedy. With that being said, there is the myth going around that gun ownership equals higher risk of death. And broadly speaking, that's really not true. And the reason why it's not true is because in the United States, there's over 500 million firearms. With that being said, there's only about 336 million people. So there's more guns than there are people in the United States. So if firearm ownership equaled death, there wouldn't be anybody alive left in the United States. And so the fact that there is, and that we haven't seen firearm related deaths, and if we're gonna go to the full statistics that you usually see posted of about 40,000 people lose their life every year to firearms, that includes suicides. Statistically speaking, that's not even a percent of the U.S. population. There's more people who die from fentanyl. There's more people who die from car accidents, about 55,000 a year in car accidents, so on and so forth, right? So diving into the statistics here, I think is important and kind of can bust the myth, right? So the Trace, which is not a pro-gun organization by any stretch of the imagination, just released some statistics about firearm-related deaths in the United States, and we have now dipped below pre-COVID levels. Now, there was a massive spike in gun violence 2020 on. It kind of peaked in 2021 and has slowly come down since then, and then there's been a cliff that just happened this past year in 2025, and we went down below 2019 before COVID. And the reason why I think that's significant in a couple ways is, first off, I should say it's always high. It's always too high. Anytime people lose their life, again, it's too high, but we should understand what these statistics are. So about 35,000 people lost their lives to firearms last year. Now, that includes suicides. So if we remove suicides, and I think we can all agree suicides is a separate category. That's a mental health issue. Whether you use a firearm, whether you jump off a bridge or something like that, you're going to end, or take pills or whatever it is, you're going to end up finding a way to commit that act. So I think we should always separate that out, because that is dealing with a mental health issue of an individual, not necessarily a firearm issue. Even though it's never really a firearm issue. It is about the user. But with that being said, that's a separate category in a like a healthcare area. So that it leaves about 17,000 left. Is what they found. About 17,000 people lost their lives to firearms in 2025. That's a 14% dip from the previous year, and it's about a 30% dip from the height in 2021, which there's a couple myths I think that this does bust. Number one, it busts the myth that, uh, with all the post Bruin ruling, which came out in 2022, which is there's going to be greater proliferation of firearms in the United States. Therefore, firearm deaths in the United States is just going to explode. We are not seeing that happen. And then we have to ask the question, why did it explode in 2020 and 2021? There's a very obvious answer. It was the post George Floyd riots and the anti-policing movement, where you saw this massive explosion in violence. I'm not saying that they gave a smoking gun okay, but you had people in charge that kind of wink, wink, nod, nodded at those people committing it and said that that there wasn't going to be any consequences. And you saw people unfortunately do evil things. That's what happened. Um, and again, we're not diving into politics here. It's just about breaking things down. I mean, that we have to get to the crux of the issue as to why it spiked and then what's happened since it's come down. Some of that is that life has kind of gone back to normal-ish. There is an element of that, of course. There's going to be elements of law enforcement has started to crack down on these things. And there's been federal intervention here underneath this administration going after actual traffickers and stuff as opposed to the Jim and Joe taxpayer that are just having a hobby in their garage. So there is that. There's been policy changes there as well. Um, and when we really, really, really break this stuff down, about 2,000 people of these 1,700 or 17,000, excuse me, that lost their life are what we would call justified shoots. These are law enforcement shootings. These are self-defense shootings. These are the good guys stopping bad guys with guns. That's what that statistic is. And there's about 200 accidental deaths in there, which is always terrible. And that's something that we here at 2F by C Tactical believed can be prevented 100%. That's where education and training comes into play. I personally believe we should bring firearm education back into schools. The odds are high that you're going to end up running into a firearm in your life somewhere down the line. So you should know how to handle it, check and make sure it's safe, and if you need to, turn it over to an adult or whatever in a safe manner. And it kind of removes some of the stigma out of these things. Just because this thing is sitting here doesn't mean it's deadly. Now, if I load this up, this is unloaded. Of course, it can be a deadly weapon, but we can also use these things in a safe and fun manner. So, bringing that kind of education back into the schools, I think, would be a huge, huge boost um, to eliminating those accidental firearm-related deaths. And that is something that I will say is wishy-washy as they have been on the Second Amendment, this administration, they are actually attempting to do that. They did give like a $1 million grant to the University of Wyoming to develop Pro 2A educational materials to be taught in schools. Now, of course, states are going to have a say in that. It won't be necessarily mandated by the Fed, or I wouldn't think it's mandated by the feds, maybe this administration, but that could be something that will always be yanked and implemented. Who knows, moving forward when those materials are out. So you're going to have some states, which I would assume Minnesota would be one of them, that will not adopt that materials, and then you'll have others like probably Texas, Oklahoma, and the southern states that will absolutely put those into school, which will give you kind of the mismatch collection of education and laws that we currently have. But with that being said, that is a positive move, and I do think that can help lower those statistics. And so the purpose of this particular episode is reading the statistics, busting the myth, and what can we do moving forward. And I think that's really that's where this conversation always breaks down. You hear from the anti-gun people. And that's happening in Minnesota right now. Our legislative session is about to start, and there's been a whole slew of bills, quote unquote, assault weapons bans, red flag laws, mandatory safe storage, all these things, banning of like binary triggers and all this kind of stuff, that the typical things, the low hanging fruit, if you will, that people go for and make no difference whatsoever when it comes to actual gun violence. So when we look at these statistics, it could be like we can also ask ourselves, once we understand them and we break them down to their base metrics, What can we do to effectuate change, period, right? It's not as easy as adding a seatbelt to a car because we all know adding a seatbelt to the car did reduce deaths. That's true, but it didn't eliminate them. And it's not the seatbelt by itself. It's some of the safety mechanisms like airbags and stuff that's come in. So there's a whole bunch of things that you have to do if you want to effectuate change. And always, 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 when we're speaking of constitutional rights, you have to juxtapose whatever that change is you're trying to achieve upon the Bill of Rights of the Constitution that you and I are afforded, that are given to us by God and cannot be restricted by man. So there's always this balancing act. And the only way to change that balancing act test is to amend and change the Constitution. So when we go back to our totals, you're looking at a little over 16,000 people who lose their life every year to gun violence. And these are murders and stuff. That is correct. When we talk about mass shootings, those dipped to 20-year lows, actually, according to the trace. And they defined that as four or more shot without, not including the shooter. So those dipped to 20-year lows. There's very few instances of that. Now, to be fair, there's very few instances of that normally. So when you hear the shooting statistics numbers, when we say mass shootings, we typically, or at least our minds, go to those horrific, news headline events like Columbine and Parkland and stuff like that. That's not necessarily how they define mass shootings here in the trace statistics. It's four or more shot. You do see a lot of gang violence kind of get caught up in this quote unquote mass shooting category, but it dropped to a little over 20-year lows. So you have to go all the way back to 2005 in order to see the stats equal what we saw today. So it's again a great step forward. We want this to go to zero always, and then so then that happened to be a little under 100 people total. And again, that's kind of where a lot of the stats or the myths you hear lie quite a bit, unfortunately. When they talk about unarmed people, killed by police, people always say, well, it's in the thousands, and it ends up being like three. Um, it's not, it's not, uh, it's not ever the big numbers that the news would always make you believe. But with that being said, so we have about 16,000 people, who lose their life of firearms. 95% of them come from 6 cities in the United States. That's it. So when we break this down to its bare bones, we want to make change. I'm a former college football player, and that's something we always would do as an athlete. Is when you want to get an edge or when you want to know what you can do to win, you're going to look at all the statistics of what the other team does and try to break it down to its base elements to put yourself in that best success or that best case for success moving forward. And that's kind of the way I treat this kind of stuff still to this day. So if we have a 6 city problem in the United States, and that's not to say there aren't murders committed with firearms outside these 6 cities. That's not what I'm saying. You have to ask yourself what is being done in those cities that's so drastically different. Why are we not seeing those results in, say, a place like New Prague, Minnesota, with 10,000 people? Moving forward, when you say, well, what are these 6 cities doing that, like a New Prague, Minnesota isn't, and why are you getting the different results? Because if we just did gun violence per population, then there would be some in New Prague, but there's not. In fact, we haven't had any shootings at all. And governance matters. There's no question about that. It's not a gun control issue because Minneapolis has the same gun laws that New Prague does because we have state preemption. That means that the cities cannot pass laws above and beyond what the state laws are. So when it comes to concealed carry, when it comes to types of weapons, when it comes to FFL rules or whatever, they have the same laws that we do. So it can't be that. It could be the kind of people that live there that sure, you might have a cultural issue in some of these places, and that's for sure part of it. Maybe it's just the fact you have so many people on top of one another. That's why you always see gang violence in these larger cities. It does become a harder question when you talk about a place like Chicago. Chicago has always been, historically speaking, a violent city. If you go all the way back to the early 1900s, the early 20th century, it's famous for all those gangs, like and crime kingpins like Al Capone and John Dillinger and Machine Gun Kelly and all those people back in the 20s and 30s. It's infamous for those during the bootlegging days, and of course it was violent before that. So that's a harder question when it comes to some cities. And I'm not going to sit here and say I have all the answers here because that's not true. I don't think anybody has all the answers when it comes to this. But we always want, fact-based, uh, fact-based and realistic outcomes when it comes to policy. And that's where us on the pro 2A side just get absolutely, we go crazy over the proposals put in front of us because no one wants death and no one wants violence. We're just asking, could we have some, when we say common sense, you're saying common sense gun control, we're saying common sense outcomes. You slapping a ban on AR 15s isn't going to stop anything. That's not how that works. We just saw in Australia, right outside Sydney, and in Bondi Beach, that just because you go and confiscate, over 50% or more of the firearms in the country, that ain't going to stop it either. We're seeing in places like Paris, because you've removed firearms from society, mass violence doesn't end. Or London, mass violence doesn't end, which is why they're now banning knives over like 3 inches or 4 inches, right? Where it turns out that those kind of things aren't actually effectuating change. What could? Well, there's no question that reopening mental health facilities and involuntary commitment of certain individuals for sure is part of the solution. Ever since we closed a lot of those in the 90s and early 2000s, violence has spiked. But we also need to be honest historically too. Violence in the United States is way lower than it was in, say, 1853 or 1873 or even early 1900s. Way lower. The Wild West is famous for the bandits, the shootouts, the uh, the uh, the the hangings at dawn on Saturdays, or the duels and all that, like, and of course the Native American raids, and then the settler raids, and all the wars, whether it be the tribal wars, Native Americans against Native Americans, or Native Americans versus settlers, or the Mexican American War, or the battle for Texas independence. Right? We could go. The list goes on and on and on. Violence back then was way higher than it is in society, and there's no question about that. We also need to be honest about when they rank the United States in shootings in the world. We don't compare to, say, like Africa. They never list those countries, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Iran, or Libya. Right? We never hear those. You're telling me, you're telling me that the United States has more shootings and murders with firearms, gun violence, than, say, Nigeria. That's not true, and we all know it. Or even Somalia, or any place like that. We all know that's not true. Now, when you come to Western cultures, maybe the guns are being used more in the United States because of our Second Amendment and the fact there are a lot of guns in society. That's not to say that those other countries aren't having any gun violence at all. It's not like there's no gun violence in the UK. I mean, you want to bring up the IRA or anything else going on over there, there's gun violence in the UK to this day, right? Just because they outlawed guns in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, doesn't mean that there isn't gun violence there. But it does mean that the types of violence, or I should say, the methods used for violence might have changed with the times. Hence why, again, London's putting in a knife ban. I would say that's in response to knives being used. We don't see a high knife crime in the United States, but again, the tools change, but the outcomes don't. And I think that's why this Trace article is very interesting. It gives us some rubrics and some actual stats that we can go, listen, this is what you say. You say more guns equals death. We're actually seeing a mass drop in gun violence in the United States. Yet there are more guns in proliferation today in 2026 than there was in 2020. By your rubric, we should see gun violence growing, not going down. Why? Maybe some of it is going after some of these gangs in the United States, where it be the Venezuelan Trinidad or the New Age cartels or the Sinaloa cartels. Maybe it is some of that. We're putting those in, and a lot of gangs in the United States are affiliated with cartels outside the United States. That's going to be part of it. Maybe it is removing some criminal offenders from the United States. That has a lot to do with it. Incarcerating those citizens here. And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of these cities are not doing, like Minneapolis, is putting criminals in jail when they do something wrong. We're seeing cashless bail and all these other things. And again, this is not to be political. It's just to say that when we look at this stuff, what are things that we can do and what is proven? And when you look at the way that like the 90s went, someone who's old enough to remember them, you know, all the cleaning up in the big cities that went on was from some harsh crime policies that were done largely by Democrats. So this is not a one side versus the other issue. They did some of the right things when they put in the crime bill under Bill Clinton, and they went hard after criminals and they put them away and they weren't on the streets, right? And reversing a lot of those policies is why when reopening some of the mental health facilities, and then kind of learning how to talk to one another. So if there's one thing out of this video I hope that people can get is re-engaging with one another in person, having that human connection is key. And I know this is a little bit longer video, but that was the whole point. It's like this is a really interesting article. Everyone should read it. They break down the stats quite a bit. It's always hard to look at these from some of these organizations that aren't that are obviously anti-gun, and the trace certainly trends into that area a lot of times. But at least in this particular instance, it was just about pure stats, and they broke it down pretty well. With that being said, I hope you stay tuned. I think we're gonna probably try to do this maybe once a month, where we do like a myth busting Thursday or whatever. There's so many myths about firearms that I hear every single day, even at our shop with people shopping, people who aren't necessarily anti-gun. They just want to they just know what they've heard, and what they heard unfortunately is incorrect for whatever reason, and we'd love to bust those here. Again, please like, comment, subscribe. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. We're gonna have a lot of exciting things from SHOT Show. If you have a moment, I did put a link to that Trace article in our Patriots Almanac section of our website. We can't link the website here because, YouTube and all that. But if you do check us out at 2F by C Tactical, and check out our news section, there is an article there, and it's worth a read. Again, worth kind of understanding the stats. And we'll see you next time.